the MinRes guys, we'd gone to look at contract crushing and screening, and we'd shared all the historical data and stuff like that. And you know, Chris had the foresight to see where lithium was going to go, and said, well, actually, we'd like to do a farm-in, right? That ended up being an incorporated joint venture.
Hello, and welcome to the Market Bull podcast. Please note, topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial or investment advice. Chris Reed is the Managing Director and CEO of Neometals, which is listed on the ASX and AIM exchange under code NMT. Neometals is a sustainable battery materials producer, and it has developed a suite of green battery material processing technologies that reduce reliance on traditional mining processes and help support the circular economic principles. Chris explained his history in the mining sector and his time helping Mineral Resources develop the Mt Marion Lithium mine. Chris discussed an encounter that he had with two gentlemen back in Germany of 2008, which set him on his path to develop battery recycling technologies with a focus on the electric vehicle market in particular. Neometals has three core business units with Tier 1 joint venture and off-takers involved. Here is Chris Reed from Neometals. So hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and this is the Market Bull podcast. Joining me for the new format of the show, I can happily say this is the first time we're doing the video-audio combination at high quality, is Chris Reed, the Managing Director and CEO of Neometals. As I say, you've spoken all across the world on the lithium recycling space and this emerging sort of picture that we're facing, and you've been in it for countless years. But it's your welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure. And the test dummy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like I say, it's not a rehearsal. We're going live. We're going straight into it.
Oh, well, you're probably not setting the bench high, so that's good.
Oh, so talk to us a little bit about your backstory, because Neometals has had it's in the battery recycling sector, and there's a lot of the discussions about this looming sort of what do we do with all these EVs that are coming online, and then what do we do afterwards, and what do we do with all these materials? But getting into your background in the lithium industry, how did it all start, if I go back to your time in Germany?
Yeah, well, look, we developed two gold mines. We had a good underground gold mine. We had a bit of a disaster with our big open pit gold mine. But before we did that, we acquired Mt Marion. So that was in 2009. We got into lithium. I got a heads up, really, just in Germany, looking at some test work that we were doing out in Essen at Polesius, which was on Barrambie, and it was just a chance meeting in a hallway with a couple of gentlemen, who basically said, "Oh, you're the young kid with the vanadium project. We're going to need that in 10 years, but can you find us some lithium?" And, I was sort of like, lithium, okay. I'll just put that in the memory bank. I'll do that later. So, I asked the Polesius guy, like, who's Waldorf and Stadler there? And he said, "Did they talk to you?" And I said, "Yeah, well, they did." And he said, "Whatever they said,
take note of it.
You want to hear it, because one was Johnson Controls R&D, who are the world's biggest battery maker for automotives at that stage, and the other one was Mercedes-Benz or Daimler-Benz's R&D. So, I Googled lithium. I hadn't really had a deep look at it, and then worked out spodumene was one of the minerals. And my first job out of school was working at New Celebration, and we were doing early stage exploration of what ended up being Ghost Crab and the Mt Marion gold mine, and we used to have to drive along a fence line at the corner of location 53, which sort of runs along the top edge of the deposit. We used to have to drive over this spodumene, this white stuff, and it was hard as the knobs of hell.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I do know where there's spodumene, and got back to WA and looked and saw who owned it, and got him in, and we did a deal on it.
Yeah, because the Mt Marion mine, a lot of people are familiar with that, given the MinRes and Ganfeng involvement there, and it's one of the major players now in the sector. But that sort of gave its way to really the the opportunity for Neometals. So for those that aren't familiar with what Neometals is, what is the company and how did that really get that ball rolling?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of how we moved into the recycling, so, we started building Mt Marion in the back half of 15. And then in 16, the board said, oh, well, that's great. Chris is constructing the plant. Chris Ellison, it'll get up and running. How do we get more exposure to the battery materials? And you got to remember that at that stage, you'd had Greenbushes, obviously as a world's tier 1 deposit. I don't think, in my mind, there's really any other tier 1 deposit. So I'm happy to be proven wrong. But, it was hard to develop Mt Marion because we'd had the Galaxy, Mount Catlin rise and fall.
Yep.
So really, the board just said, well, how do we get more exposure? And I said, well, it's going to be hard to get more lithium exposure. The bigger known outcrops, everyone's, the smart geos have gone out and
locked up
and tied them up, right?
Yeah.
So, Pilgangoora, that was an old tintantalum plant, and then later on Wodgina and stuff like that. So they were known about pegmatites that had just really never been looked at for their lithium content. And so I said to the board, well, getting the lithium, the low-hanging fruit has been pegged.
Yep.
Right? And we're in this stage where we're building what was the world's largest greenfields concentrator. So it was going to be a big step to go big into lithium upstream mining at that stage. And I said, well, look, if you look in the battery, we're transitioning from lithium cobalt consumer-based electronics. That was the main source of the lithium demand when we originally developed, going into EVs.
Yeah.
Right? And at that stage, they were NMC 111. So you needed nickel, manganese, cobalt. And so we identified cobalt as having the best demand supply fundamentals for us to have a look at. But we couldn't find a good deposit outside of the Congo. Then it dawned on us that the LCO batteries in your Apple phones and laptops are 20% by weight cobalt. So we got a ton of batteries and developed a process to remove the cobalt. It looked fantastic, right? Just super high prices, unbelievable IRRs. But the market was relatively small.
Yep.
And only growing at GDP because the world's saturated with phones and laptops. And really all the growth was coming from the cars. And all of a sudden, instead of having lithium cobalt, you had lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, alloyed, an aluminium alloyed. They're a combined oxide, right, in the cathode. And that's significantly harder to process.
Yeah.
So, we came back to Australia, developed a process. We piloted it at SGS Lakefield in Canada. Then we were able to attract a global partner. And I guess the niche for us was, and it was a bit like Mt Marion, MinRes were great at building plants. Right, this was their first one, and as anyone that's got a lithium mine will tell you, they're quite the beasts to get to
Get it up and running.
To get up and running. I don't know that they ever run at steady state. That's because the ore can be pretty variable. But they did a fantastic job. So in battery recycling, we're like, well, we've got a process. We know the market. Like we know they're building the cell plants. We know there's scrap in significant volumes, and what is not scrap will go into a car and come back in 7 to 12 years, right? And so we needed to partner with someone who could build plants. We just couldn't see anyone out there who was actually going to service the market. Now, we weren't going to China, and China is pretty much self-sufficient for recycling. Perhaps not to the same standard that we've got now, but that's only a matter of time. So we partnered with SMS Group, who this year are celebrating their 150th anniversary. And got construction facilities on 4 continents, 95 sites around the world. So you know, we can see, you know, and they're building the cell plants ahead of the brine deposits and the mines.
Yep.
And that's why we've got a forecast shortage
Yes.
in lithium emerging, right? But we couldn't see up the other end who's building the recycling plants. Now, we've had a couple of American competitors, but they want to do merchant recycling. So buy batteries and take custody, make black mass, and then make chemicals. We had a look at that. They're enormously expensive. So, you know, Redwood and Lysical, I think, raised $750 million US to do that. And I guess, you know, having been in lithium since 2009 and being embedded in the supply chain for a fair period of time, we understand. And the first thing is you sit down and you want to understand what your customers want.
Yep.
Right? They've got a problem. You need to find a solution. Now, sometimes supplying the material, i.e. lithium, is a solution to their problem when they make cells for the first time. At the end of life, and we can see with the EU battery regulations that came into full force 2 weeks ago, that they've got new problems. They have to recycle. They have to have recycled content in new batteries. The definition of recycling and the hurdle rates is very high. And so, you know, I think as we look at our process, you know, we've put out our engineering cost studies and stuff like that to show the economic value and why you would do it, because the car makers don't want to, you know, in our process, they can recover $10,000 worth of their materials.
It's a no-brainer.
And it costs them, say, $4,000, and our royalty on top would add another $1,000. So they make $5,000, but they get all their materials back. That enables them to make new cells with a low carbon footprint, because recycling, we absolve it of its previous CO2 footprint. In terms of the feedback that we get from our products is that it actually makes better batteries. So it was battery quality to start off with that was made from a lower grade concentrate. And so when we process batteries, the materials in there are battery grade. So the batteries actually get better.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Which is interesting. So we can see shortages. The primary thing is that these guys get their materials back, as opposed to selling batteries to merchant recyclers. Now, fortunately for us in Europe, you know, we knew we would have to build a plant and demonstrate that to the car makers and cell makers for them to take us seriously. So we've got our own operation in Hilkenbach, Germany, and we shred batteries that are coming out of all the local car makers. You know, and that then leads on, you know, you got to show them technically that you can do it. Then we show them the economics, but really their problems are around having a secure supply chain.
Yep.
Because that's a threat. If they don't have enough cells and they don't have enough raw materials, they can't sell cars unless you're Freddie Flintstone.
Yeah.
So closing the loop for them and creating a
circular
resilient
economy.
supply chain, exactly. A path to lower carbon footprint, right? Because I think there was a study put out in the last month saying that if you've got an EV in Australia with the average Australian mix of how we generate electricity, you have to drive about 95,000 Ks to become a net benefit.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? You know, that would take me a long time to become a net benefit. Whereas if we can strip the carbon out, that can happen, you know, probably somewhere between 1 and 2 years, which is important. So I think, you know, we're in the business of providing solutions. So we've identified
The looming
a problem or a need, and then we turn our minds to solutions. And that's whether you look at the recycling business. You know, we were presented with the opportunity to access the world's highest vanadium grade stockpile, right, above the surface, up in Sweden, and we had to create a flow sheet there that would recover the vanadium, but you know, the constraint that we had is that we couldn't use acids. So we had to use an alkaline leach and to create an inert tailings product, because they're pretty sensitive
Yeah.
up there around it. And so we've done that, and we can actually turn what was a very high carbon footprint material, so traditionally vanadium, mined, concentrated, roasted in a kiln, and then perhaps made into vanadium slag, or ferrovanadium. So that has a carbon footprint of about 30 plus tons of CO2. And because we've developed a process, essentially we get water, a bit of sodium hydroxide in it, we capture and sparge CO2 in there and sequester that in the tailings. We've got the LCA indicates that we can get down to about -4 tons, which is good.
Yeah.
So that's providing a solution to an opportunity that was presented to us. So we didn't identify the need. That was an opportunity that needed a bespoke hydromet solution.
Yeah.
With Eli, which is our lithium technology that we own 70% of, with MinRes that owns 30%. So we did the deal with MinRes, I'm going to say September or October 2009. We made the decision to mine the following year. So drilled out the resource, and Western Mining had obviously left us with a very good start.
Yeah.
So they'd had it for 50 years, had an inferred reserve, resource and reserve under an old, I think it was the 89 JORC code, and had done 2 full pilot plants on it, one in the School of Mines, one in Adelaide. So we had a great start and made the decision to mine, started clearing the mining areas, the plant areas, and then the price war started, the South Americans versus the Chinese. And the prices collapsed, went from 400 back then down to about 240.
Jeez.
Was the lowest. And of course, we couldn't.
Decimated the industry in a way.
Well, it was only green bushes in terms of spodumene, but we couldn't have started up. So, we sat down and thought, we've got a problem. We need to we'll never be able to compete against these guys on cost for producing lithium carbonate. The only chance is if we go straight through to hydroxide. So we need to turn a dilithium oxide, Li2O, into LiOH. What's the best way to make a lithium hydroxide or any alkaline metal hydroxide is to run electricity through a chloride solution. So then we worked backwards that we were going to need to roast it, put it into hydrochloric acid, make a lithium, purify it, make a lithium chloride that's suitable for electrolysis, right? And to make lithium chloride as a lithium hydroxide as the primary product.
Yeah.
So that's where Eli came from, electrolytic lithium. And so we did that on Mt Marion, did it on Greenbushes, and we've done it on the South American deposits. Like, it works really, really well. And we put out the engineering study, and it'll strip out about 60% of the operating costs. It'll similarly strip out about 60% of the carbon footprint, would be our guess, looking at the numbers. And so what you do is, for brine producers, instead of having to bring soda ash down from Wyoming and making your own sodium hydroxide or caustic, you use your own lithium hydroxide, and then you sparge CO2 into the liquid before you crystallize it and make carbonate. So basically, you're taking those reagents out of your operating costs that are a very, very large part, and you're putting in electricity. So, we've done a number of studies on the technology, hard rock and brines. And in our tests, our continuous test work, we've started with synthetic, then we put hard rock and then mixed it with brine and then run it on brine only, and it works perfectly.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we're at the stage now of piloting the electrolysis up in Canada, and then going to demonstration plant next year up in Portugal with Bondelti.
So they're the 3 aspects really there described in depth of what Neometals focuses. And when I was watching your presentation at Diggers and Dealers, you had a great slide there with each three of the aspects, and then almost the outline of who's involved at each stage along each of the processes. And I mean, there's some big names in there. So, I mean, can you illustrate or just let us know which companies are involved at which aspects of the three components?
And look, the Australian market doesn't really understand mining and processing related technologies. There haven't been massive amounts of success stories.
Yeah.
So, just as we approached Mt Marion in terms of we identified a need for lithium and we had the deposit, the solution that we needed to find was someone that was capable of going from the deposit through to the port.
Yeah.
And the other thing we needed was obviously an off-taker. So the MinRes guys, we had gone to look at contract crushing and screening, and we'd shared all the historical data and stuff like that. And Chris had the foresight to see where lithium was going to go. And said, well, actually, we'd like to do a farm-in, right? That ended up being an incorporated joint venture. But to do that, we needed to have an offtake partner. Now, there weren't that many in the lithium business at that stage. There weren't a lot of lithium converters up in China. Obviously, the Tianji guys were in Greenbushes, and so essentially we had Ganfeng.
Yeah.
So we'd had a long history and been to the altar a couple of times, but never got married. And we'd take a pay offtake from Ganfeng and a mining services agreement with Mineral Resources, and we had to share to de-risk it. And ultimately, we were able to grow Mt Marion then from, we were looking at 120,000 tonnes of annual production. By the time we sold out, it was doing just under 500,000.
Yeah, incredible.
So you've got to work out what you're good at. Like, we were gold miners, right? So it was a new area. We didn't have any in-house expertise, but we learnt along the way. We learnt lithium chemistry and downstream processing. We've just applied it to different things. So
what's like your point when you were saying, I heard it on I think it was the AFR, when you were talking about, you're driving over it, and in certain times these resources are just not even required. We just completely neglect them. And we're seeing that across the board now, where there's these incredible deposits of either rare earths or lithium that, they've been there for quite a while. It's just no one really wanted to do it because it was, again, all about gold. And I said before, Diggers and Dealers is all lithium now as opposed to gold. It's this changing of the guard of like where the demand is going. And it's quite fascinating to see that, where your introduction was initially in 2008 and 9 to then the stepping stones to then
it was
the afterlife side.
Definitely lonely for a while.
Yeah.
And look, and so, like I said, there was the price war in 2011. We didn't develop Mt Marion until 2015. So you go through cycles. There's still cycles in lithium, but I think they're not as long as they were before. And it was amazing, I remember in 2015 presenting on Mt Marion, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to build the world's biggest greenfields concentrator and stuff like that. And Cookie goes, geez, that's great, Chris. I almost believed it.
Yeah.
But that would have been the only lithium story in 2015. Yet you wind forward this year and there's more, I wouldn't say just lithium, but more
critical metals.
Yeah, critical minerals, across the gambit. And I mean, that's great. Like, to maintain our standard of living as a nature, as a country, there's no real national strategy to diversify the economy. Right, the government's just taken a laissez-faire, leave it, and we're just down to luck.
Yeah.
If iron ore prices are good, oil prices are good, coal prices are good, other commodity prices are good, we thrive.
Yeah.
But what happens when they become less relevant? Right, we don't have a plan.
And that's where you look to, I always look at this turning point where car manufacturers, and you're involved with quite a few, when they first started getting more involved in the downstream aspects of their manufacturing, either for buying into mines and securing supply, it was almost then this transition of, well, geez, if they're doing it from that level, they have ridiculous quotas to be hitting. Them diving further down the supply chain was almost like a first, and it hasn't happened. And then you've got these incredible government stimulus packages, look to America with the Inflation Reduction Act. There is a huge amount of money going towards the EV future and this renewable future, and almost without the bleeding obvious is that recycling has to be a component, and the EU changes as well. Some of the things I'm hearing about that is like it's going to completely revolutionize the shopping experience from a consumer point of view, but companies have so much more to comply with. So then that's the point I want to know about. How did you, if you go back to 2008-9, how did you start developing these partnerships and relationships with these car manufacturers? Because your Mercedes-Benz is, well, yeah, it's no small one. And just this week, I mean, we're recording 25th of August, you had another announcement about Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah. So I think, look, the first car maker that we spoke to and had on site would have been 2014, would have been the Tesla guys. So they realised that they were years ahead of the other car makers, and we went back and forward and used to see them. And so ultimately they knew that they'd have to do it. And you can see that down in their Austin gigafactory, that they're putting a spodumene converter next door. Right. So, you know, but to be clear, these car makers aren't going to electric vehicles because they want to save the earth. Right. Elon showed them that there's a new business model that you can make $7,000 or $8,000 per unit, as opposed to maybe $1,500 a unit. This is when you sell them. Tesla don't really make that much money out of parts. Like, I've had one for 5 years. I've done the wiper blades. That's it.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're doing it so that they can make more money. And cars were electric before the internal combustion engine anyway. So, you know, these guys, and that's good for the car makers, but they're good for the consumer too, in that the ongoing running costs are, you know, 10 to 20% of an internal combustion engine car.
Yeah.
So that's that's the economic driver behind it. And then you're seeing the car makers having to, and so in that transition, the government's had to, you know, because they're such big employers in Europe and the US, they've got the policymakers to commit. So, like, I think in 2021, you know, it was COVID, and car sales and EV car sales are coming down a little bit. And the German government announced like 155 billion euros in a package. So that was to put 77,000 high voltage chargers in 14,000 petrol stations. And I think it was a 6,000 euro subsidy.
Yeah.
To which the French responded back the next week with a 12,000 euro subsidy. And so then they've recognised that they have to reach up. No car maker's ever had to reach upstream to get this sort of stuff, but they've never had to put batteries in cars either.
Yeah.
So they're having to become cell makers. They're doing that via joint ventures generally now, except for Tesla. Well, I mean, Tesla, they sort of are, because Panasonic is really making their cells just in a Tesla factory. But then they're having to guarantee that the cell makers, because the cell makers, they all want fixed prices, right? The car makers. And the cell makers are going, well, I can't, because once we get down to $100 a kilowatt hour, the storage, the raw materials are 80% of the cost. So they're not giving any of the car makers anything fixed. So then the car makers, to make sure that they can control the cost of the cells, are having to, they're not going to make cathodes, but they have to secure the materials to go into the cathode producers. And, you know, that, and when you have the European Critical Raw Materials Act, or the battery regulations are really, the Europeans have been the biggest net importers of cells for the last 3 years globally. So that then they create a fortress around it. That was number one. Then they have the Critical Raw Materials Act to try to stimulate domestic production. And that's really to protect car making in Europe. And obviously you need the rare earths and stuff for the magnets. And there's a whole chain of what you need. And then same in the US. The US was a couple of years. So when we worked out where were we going to deploy first, we thought, oh, well, North America. And they actually realised that Europe was going to get to critical mass 2 to 3 years ahead of the US. Now, how that by 2030, that's forecast the US will be in front, but they've had to
really accelerate
they've
their
had
plans.
to bring in the Inflation Creation Act, to stimulate.
That's a huge amount of money that they've allocated for that.
It's ridiculous, but so I presented at the WA Mining Club yesterday. I was just saying, you as a nation in Australia, you can't have the lucky strategy. You've got an opportunity now, because we have the critical metals, to almost make sure that we downstream process everything we practically can.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And you've got a sovereign wealth fund, right, that could arguably be, better funded, but instead they just put 500 million into NAIF to try to distribute. And I'm like, well, the debt is generally not the issue, it's the equity. So sometimes grants or participation by a sovereign are worth it. And the European countries have it, like for our vanadium project at the moment. We've got the EIB providing half the debt, commercial banks for the other half, the Finnish government's guaranteeing 80% of the face value. Through the various Finnish government institutions, we could tap them if we needed to, in terms of subordinated debt, probably 50 or 60 million euros.
Yeah.
And it's a completely, because they want to diversify their economy.
Yeah.
Right. So their opportunity is some of the slags in Finland. It's a great place to operate. So they, I think when we decided to locate the plant there in Finland, there was 100 from the local government, the province and the federal government. There was 100 guys working to make sure that we were there and rolling out the red carpet. So from, access to utilities, access to port land for the processing plant. It's in Australia, it's become harder. Like, if you don't want to do anything and diversify the economy, at least make it easier for the miners. And we know regulatory and approvals, it's got harder. But so where the government's got to help then on the other side to try to level the playing field. Otherwise, as a mining industry, I don't know.
Well, we've got a golden opportunity.
In the last 10 years, the headwinds have been getting stronger.
Yeah.
Right. And now you start to ask, like the CEOs that I talk with, it's the investors, they're a bit myopic and they want front-ended returns, just like us. But, what's the timeline? And I'm like, could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So are we going to, for the existing mines, are we going to be able to have enough ore permitted to maintain our current base? How do you get new ones? Like, how many new gold mines have been, there's only a handful you can think of.
Yeah.
New ones.
This approach of there's been a lack of development into any sort of mining over the past 10 to 15 years, no major discoveries, and now this pressing demand, and there's suddenly this almost panic of like, geez, like what are we going to do? And then to the point of, Australia almost, it's we've got this golden opportunity, but it's been quite almost counteractive in the way of halting it with regulations, where you're seeing other countries and jurisdictions go, look, we've got a potential to really capitalize on a trend that's going to last for, I don't know how many years, to 2050 onwards. There's a huge economic opportunity to tap into, and it's just about, why aren't we?
Look, and I think when you have a look in the case of lithium, the fact that the early deposits have the early developments were all partnered with, like I said, there's only a few big ones at that time. So, you've got Albemarle bought into Greenbushes, and then they bought GRM in China, which was a big, like the third biggest hydroxide producer, second or third. So all of a sudden, a brine producer had an interest in a mine in Australia and a mine in China, and then decided, well, I can parlay that and do that close. I can do that in Australia, so I don't have to haul 7 tons up there and stuff like that. So I think some of the big lithium companies, in terms of going downstream, so Tianji, Albemarle, and then, SQM, Wesfarmers, and then, Wodgina and Pilbara at some stage, will be integrated.
Yeah.
The market is sort of doing it for them. Okay, well, that's making the existing deposits. And if you integrate, you lower the cut-off grade, so to speak, right? Because you can make more money out of it. You make more money out of the chemical processing, probably in the long run. So, but then you've got to get the other opportunities up, because, maybe in 5, certainly by the end of the decade, Australia will be probably past peak lithium. Right?
Yeah, it's a daunting outlook.
No, we'll still be producing it.
Yeah.
But I don't think, like at that stage, Greenbushes will be flat out.
Yeah.
Mt Marion will be flat out. Pilgangoora or Pilbara will be flat out. Wodgina will be flat out. Kidman will be flat out. Liontown will be flat out. Then the new Azure one looks pretty good, right?
Yeah.
And so by the time that gets up and running, but I mean, like, where are the next big
that's the key.
super
There
deposits?
has to be continuous deposits being found, and I think people look to North America now as well.
And it's the time, how long it takes. So and look, with the rare earths, and then the aversion to sharing, to having common infrastructure, where you could have a larger plant and bring in more. At this stage, they just build a plant and then they go and buy their neighbours.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Well, the interesting point that, and I see it, we're seeing this incredible adoption of it, and that's where Neometals fits into the recycling component as well, as to we're getting all these batteries coming online, but even the idea that, when you looked at, I wouldn't compare it, but like a mobile phone, when they first started coming out, some of them have only got 2-3 years before you need it to, bin it and get a new one. And that's the looming other issue that you highlighted that we haven't necessarily considered about what do we do when these batteries and these materials get to the end of their life? What do we do to solve that problem? Because, as you said, there's such an opportunity for the car
there's such
manufacturers.
value there.
Exactly.
You can't
it's
throw
a
it
waste.
away. So if they leave it back, and look, some of them are changing their business models, right? And there's history of that, right? So if recent history would show you VinFast. So there's a Vietnamese car maker penetrating into the US with EVs and listing. So they listed in the US a couple of weeks ago. They're worth more than GM and Ford combined.
That's just massive.
Only making EVs, right? And so think of Tesla and them. Okay, that's fine. The VinFast guys, the model is to reduce the sticker price shock. You buy the car, you lease the battery. So you can pay a fixed per month lease of the battery, or by kilometre. Right.
The subscription model.
Subscription, and they take it at the end. And even just the concept of leasing the cars to guarantee that at the end of the lease, the car comes back to the car maker. Right. So, which won't be hard for BMW because they're probably the highest leased by percentage of the luxury car makers. So they just changed their models.
Well, that's the adaptation to realise what is going to be happening and what the opportunities are coming. So, I mean, when you're looking at that with Neometals positioned, given that, again, you've been in it for so long and it's now approaching almost this, you'd say, very exciting period of time whereby there's this really looming demand coming on, and you're probably getting quite a lot of conversations because suddenly there's been this drop of the hat of, what are we doing next? So, I mean, where do you see Neometals really developing and expanding over the next 6 to 12 to even, 24 months from everything?
Certainly for the battery recycling, we've now got our maiden plant award, and we've got a pipeline to build bigger plants. So what we designed, the original plants were designed around the Gigafactory, right? Tesla's Gigafactory. So 35 gigawatt hours at a 10% steady scrap rate, that would be enough for 20,000 tonnes per annum of feed, right? So we designed a plant around that. We built a smaller one for Mercedes, but Mercedes want understand it because they realised that recycling is, they need to do it for security, but as it stands at the moment, it's a cost. Like the German car makers, the batteries that we get from them, their waste handler pays us to take them.
Yes.
And then we keep the products and sell it. I'm
Yeah.
like, this is the greatest business in the world.
Literally, you're getting paid to take away
just
someone's waste, and then you can resell the waste.
But, you know, how much we get has been going down.
Yeah.
Right. And that's okay. We just dispose. Look, it's still a very good margin business. But our competitors are buying batteries because they've got scale. But none of them are operating, you know, anywhere near their installed capacities. Plus, the car makers don't want to lose custody of it. It is the most important thing. They've already got long supply chains to make the car sans battery.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, it's. I think we design those plants to take the scrap, and then we assume 90% goes out into the car. So our 20,000 tonne plant needs to become a 200,000 tonne plant.
Huge increase.
In say 10 years time, right? But you've got to start building it way before. So our strategy is, you know, we get the 50 tonne plants out, embed ourselves in the supply chain, do a really, really good job, because the battlefield is not now. It's production scrap. Statistically, it should be production scrap as a predominant feed this decade.
Yeah.
And then for the next 2 decades, end of life. And so we really want to produce the 200,000 tonne plants, and we've got 5 licenses out for the smaller ones at a 10% GSR, which is almost unheard of.
Jeez.
But it's the margin that we show them that they can make. At the moment, they sell batteries, say for 2,500, and they're losing 10 grand's worth of material. So they're net 7,500 down. With our process, $10,000 worth of gear back, 4,000 OPEX plus 1,000 for the royalty, they make 5. So it's $12,500 a tonne delta.
Yeah.
By coming to see us. It's a German-made plant. It'll have guarantees. I think we've got 500 KPIs in the Mercedes plant.
Jeez.
Right. So, but you know,
from scratch. Yeah.
We've got a German plant builder, so like getting a custom-made German car. Right. Put the key in, it works.
Yeah.
So, for us, that's the strategy. And Mercedes wanted a smaller one, and then other car makers want smaller ones, right? Because they're in the nascent stage. You know, they're testing out different chemistries, different formats. They're trying to homogenize the module platforms, make it easier to put them in and take them out, that sort of stuff. And so our plant in Germany should statistically be predominantly scrap with some end of life. And with that would be like warranty returns, car accidents. 70% of our feed are modules, right? So what people don't understand is when you make the individual cells, there's a scrap rate. Just by making, you know, you get the cell, it comes off the production line. Then the guys test it, right? And you're getting failed QA, QC cells. Then they put them into modules. They test the module with a battery management system over it. Some of those fail. Then they take the modules down to the car plants and bolt them in, wire them in, and they have a final QA, QC as they roll off the production line. Some of those fail. Jeez. So when you have a look at the overall scrap rates,
it's ginormous.
You'd blow your mind.
Yeah.
Right? Like those modules, 70% of our feed are modules. And I doubt how far they've actually been driven. Right? And you know, if you work out how many electric cars are going to be, and you use the same, assume they're the same
formulation,
well, the same accident rate.
Yeah.
So if it's 1%, right, as soon as you have a decent bingle in these things, the pyrotechnic fuses go off and it isolates the battery, and then the battery just gets drawn down to cool itself. But you know, you have a limited amount of time, depending on how much charge is in that cell, on how long it's going to stay cool.
Yeah.
You don't want it to get hot. So ergo, you've got to recycle, and that's why at the moment they're paying for disposal services.
Well, yeah, there's just so much happening in this space, and I mean, I can just only see it really growing, and that's why I wanted
Oh
to.
yeah, no, I mean, if you have a look at cell production globally, right, and there's 250 whatever gigafactories in production, in construction, in the pipeline, you know that there's a percentage of scrap with good confidence. When we've underestimated our plant size, we probably should have built 40,000 ton plants, right, for production scrap. And then on a lag basis, the end of life.
Yep.
But the end of life volumes have to be 9 times bigger than the production scrap if the scrap rate's 10%.
Yeah.
Right.
It's eye-watering.
It's mind-boggling. So, and in terms of rushing, our biggest returns for our shareholders in terms of the money we make from building the plants and selling them to customers, and then the royalty income, is on the 200,000 ton plants. The easiest way to market a 200,000 ton plant is to have a 20,000 ton plant for end of life, is to have a 20,000 ton plant at the car maker or the cell maker's facility adjacent to them. And then it's about sitting down and listening with your partners. Do they need the discharging and disassembly? Yes? No? Okay. The shredding spoke or the concentrator, you should put that next to your arisings. The hydromet refinery, you should put next to where you're making your cathodes so that the products can go over the fence. How do you want your lithium? Did you want it as a lithium sulfate and then you can carbonate or hydroxide? Do you want it as a lithium fluoride to go into the electrolyte?
Yeah. A lot of customizable features for them.
You've got, it's been a journey.
Yeah.
For sure. And then having to meet the EU battery regulations, was a real shock to us. We'd done 85%. We thought that was the best in the market. And then we find out from when we signed the co-op agreement with Mercedes and picked as their technology partner, it was in March last year. They put out a video and it says 96%, efficiency. And I've looked at my team and I'm like, where did these cats at Mercedes get 96% from? We're nowhere near that. And it wasn't us. So I rang up the Germans, SMS, and I said, did you guys tell these? No. And I said, well, where did they get 96 from? Because the battery regulations, as they were just in draft form at that stage, were like 85.
Yeah, that was
by 2030. And I was like, oh, we're already there. And the Mercedes guys just said, no, that's where you'll need to be to sell us a plant.
Wow.
Because it's got to be fit for purpose.
Yeah.
It needs to be compliant with the regulations. If we're not buying the plant to run it for a year, and so we were like, well, so where are the regulations heading? They said, well, 95. And we said, well, I don't know. How do you know? And they said, don't worry, we know. And we're like, oh, well, Christ.
Love that.
So how do you, and we'd been developing this process for 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, like for 6 years.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you got to go from 85 to 95. And I'm like, well, any metallurgist will tell you what happens with the final 10% recovery. It's significantly more expensive than the first 10%. So, but I think it's good for us because they don't have those regulations in China, Korea, Japan, India,
and they have to
get
or
the Americans,
into EU.
Or in Australia, but they'll all end up being homogenised at some stage.
Jeez.
So I think we find ourselves in a pretty good position. And if you're a producer of battery materials, you have to have recycled content in new cells in Europe. But where do you get that? You have to ring up a recycler who's actually making them. Okay, so how do I do that? Who do you ring if you want a recycling plant? Like, what's the solution? And so, we've had car makers say, oh yeah, we're going to do our own solution. Oh, yeah, no worries.
About 6, 7, 8 years behind the research side of it. Yeah.
What you'll work out is that, we were very early with our IP and our patents, and then we all, everything sort of works around and there's different changes and people get, like, if you had a look at it now, there'd be hundreds of patents that you would have to consider in engineering at Flowsheet. You'd be like, oh, well, this is how you do it. And then you're like, well, I'm not sure you can, right? Because other people you don't have freedom to operate that because other people have got that.
Snatched it up.
Yeah. And so, our biggest assets now are intangible.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's the thing. It's going to be
it's people,
yeah,
and the intangible IP.
yeah, and that's the point, is that these car manufacturers, it'd be great for them to do it by themselves eventually, but yeah, it's not a process that you can just switch on. I think that's potentially something they can try and do, but it's almost easier and a no-brainer for them to outsource and use someone that knows what they're doing.
Look at them. They have to do it for end of life because the volumes are so huge. In the cell production, they could probably joint venture and learn it. And to start off with, at the moment, they all just want a service.
Yeah,
like it's too hard.
Exactly,
mate.
And it's not really part of their entire business model.
I'm building EVs for the first time.
Yeah,
right.
I don't want to have to try and think about what to do after the fact.
And then I'm in joint venture with cell producers because I'm going to have to produce my own cells. I've got enough headaches.
Yeah,
right. And so we say, well, look, here's the solutions. Depending on what you want, we can, for the right people, we could operate them, do operating maintenance agreements with them, or we can find people to do it for them.
Well, you were just saying there, and it's touching on the people that you've had that have investigated this. So I want to know exactly who's actually involved in Neometals that's helped really develop and expand this company over the years with yourself.
Well, I've got lots. I mean, I've got different heads of each of the 4 assets. I've got one for the hard rock titanium asset too. So we've had the privilege to work with plenty of really good metallurgists, chemical engineers, process engineers, and I think that's where it's really come from. So if I look at some of them, on the Eli side, it would have been Dr. Tilak Bomaraju and Dr. Yatendra Sharma. As we look at the battery recycling, Gab Beer did a lot of the initial working for us. For the vanadium recovery project, Dr. Dave Robinson. So, yeah, we're fortunate in that. We've got a couple of
experienced people in that
area.
And
And it's one thing to make that transition, but you can't do that in isolation. So you've got to have the board support.
Yeah.
So we've got Dr. Natalia Strotsova. She's on the board. She's an excellent sort of domain expert in metallurgy. And Dr. Jenny Purdy. They're on that side of it, they would be the technical people in terms of overseeing what we're doing on behalf of the shareholders, what the management team's doing. Then the management team obviously has, and look, it's been exciting. And then lots of really good consultants and laboratories that we've worked with.
Yeah.
Nagram, Strategic Metallurgy, SGS. It's been
a good team, and again, a collaboration from all different aspects of strengths into formulating what it is. And I've been following the company for a while, but for listeners, and I can say viewers now, that potentially discovered Neometals now for the first time, or they want to learn more about it. I know you're listed on the ASX and the AIM, so there's information that comes out there from an investment point of view. But how else can listeners, I guess, follow the company and get engaged and, I guess, stay up to date with the activities? Because I can just see there's going to be more news coming out and more car manufacturers wanting to, again, get more from you. So where can they go to find out?
We've got a fantastic pipeline there. A few of them have been disclosed for the battery recycling, but then there's ones that, are not
in negotiations,
not binding and still subject to negotiation and that sort of stuff. So I think, getting back to where you said, geez, your partners. So the Australian market not understanding, and, sometimes tech can be a bit confusing, especially if you've got a couple of them. And people would say, well, it's complex, Chris. And I'm like, well, but that's good. If you're a one commodity, one mine developer, there's a lot of risk, right? And so for us, more of a portfolio approach and leveraging that with partners so that we can build 5, 10 plants, then they get bigger, then you get royalty streams, and then you've got lithium producers, recyclers, and the vanadium project, that suits us if we can have multiple cash flow streams. But assessing the technology is quite hard, right?
Yep.
Because a lot of being on the mining and all, we really should be deemed as a chemical company and industrials.
Arguably, say that's the
Right.
lithium
So
real
that's-
headache as well, is that it has to be more of the chemical side of it.
And so look at the partners that we've attracted. So, being selected as a global technology partner for recycling with Mercedes-Benz, it was a very competitive landscape. It took a very long time. That was March last year. Now we're supplying them a plant. You can take it. They are a very exacting customer, right?
Yeah.
And then we've got Steel Company of Canada, Itochu, and so then we got Bondelti, Portugal's largest chemical company and part of Portugal's largest conglomerate for Eli. And then and obviously SMS in the recycling is our partner. And then and with Eli Minres, Bondelti. And then for the vanadium recovery project, we've got offtake agreement with Glencore for the production. And the feedstocks are coming from SSAB.
Yeah.
So, yes.
There's a fair bit. Well, and that's where I said the slide on your Dickers and Dealers, and that will be up on the ASX announcements. I'm not sure exactly what slide it is, but that really showed me. I was like, this is hitting all of the really big players in brands that people know and love, you could say. And it just shows that the quality of the company and where it's going to go and continuously grow. So, I mean, this has been a very comprehensive chat about Neometals, and I thank you for taking the time today, Chris. And yeah, I'm excited to see what continues to unfold there, because I think, lithium is just buzz at the moment. Everyone talks about it, but it's going to be that next discussion of, end of life. And I think that's where Neometals has got a nice positioning and strategy. So yeah, thank you for speaking on the podcast today.
No worries, man. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Market Bull podcast. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe. You can follow the Market Bull on our socials at Twitter and LinkedIn by searching the Market Bull. You can also subscribe to our newsletter on the website by visiting www.themarketbull.com.au.